I'm Nikki from Cairns, and welcome to my garden. Today we are talking all things compost. Let's start with the basics. What is compost and why do we want it in our gardens? Composting is, at its most basic, a system for speeding up the natural rot and decay which would happen in nature. The end result of composting is compost. It's very original, I know. And it's what's left of all our kitchen scraps, our garden waste, and anything else that we throw into the composting after all the worms, the fungi, the microbes, and all the other critters which help in that composting process have done their work. And I know that doesn't sound particularly appealing, but plants are people and they love the stuff. One question that comes up quite often when people are first starting out with compost is, what do I actually put into my compost? There are some things which are quite obvious: your garden waste, your kitchen scraps, your lawn clippings. They're all fairly straightforward. There are also, newspapers, paper towels, coffee grounds. They're all great to go in the compost. There's no issues with those at all. Some things require a little more thought than that. Tea bags, for example, most people don't realise actually contain plastic in the bag portion of it, which means that they are not compostable. They're best to put straight into the landfill bin. There are also products which market themselves as compostable, but they're not designed for use in a home compost system. They're designed to be broken down in an industrial compost system where there are introduced bacteria. The temperatures are much hotter than the 50 or 60 degrees that we manage to achieve in our home systems. So it's definitely worth checking the packaging or checking the product to make sure it is something that you can actually compost before you add it to your pile for the first time. Other things that tend to be a little bit controversial are things like meat, bones, dog and cat poo, and there are reasons for all of those. The main issue is that they can harbour pathogens and bacteria which don't necessarily die off in lower temperatures. And in our home systems, we can't guarantee that the entire pile will reach the temperatures necessary to kill that bacteria off for a long enough period to actually have the result we want. So generally, out of an abundance of caution, it's best to avoid putting those in your compost unless you're absolutely certain that your temperature will meet your pile will meet the temperatures necessary to kill off the pathogens and the bacteria and the things that could make us or our families sick. I said before that composting is a system, one which we use to speed up a natural process. There are many ways that we can do that. There are compost tumblers, there are other ones you can buy from the hardware store, which are basically giant plastic tubs that you put your compost in and put the lid on and sort of leave it there. I chose to go with a DIY version because I very specifically wanted a 3-bay version, and I wanted quite a large system as well because we generate quite a lot of green waste. If you have a look at my bays here, you'll note that they're actually quite large. That was deliberate. In order for compost to be an efficient system, you need it to have a minimum size of about a cubic metre, and that's so that it generates enough heat to support the bacteria that need to live in that. When we're composting, there are a couple of stages that our waste actually goes through. The first is the mesophilic stage, which is basically the normal temperature range. Bacteria that live in there are present everywhere, and then as they start to do their thing, they produce gas and various other things which actually heat up the compost pile, and it enters what is called a thermophilic stage. Now this is sort of between 50 and 60 degrees roughly, and a whole different colony of bacteria like to live in that temperature range, much like plants from Tasmania probably aren't happy up here in North Queensland. Bacteria also have different climatic conditions which they prefer. This thermophilic or hot composting system is where most of the action happens. It's a much faster process to break down all the proteins and cellulose and other things which comprise the things which we've put into our compost. And then once the bacteria that are living in that thermophilic environment run out of things to actually consume, it then starts to cool back down, and it eventually returns back into a mesophilic stage, and it continues to cool down, and then when it's all done, it's just effectively a pile of very, very fancy dirt. Another thing that comes up very often when you first start researching composting is the carbon and nitrogen ratio, and what exactly that means for each gardener. The ratio, or the ideal ratio, is 30 units of carbon for each unit of nitrogen, but how do we work that out? I'm not going to go and measure the nitrogen content of everything that I put into my compost. So it's simplified down, and they say that you should try and have sort of 30 parts of brown materials, so sticks, branches, dead leaves, wood chip, newspaper, anything like that, to each very, very green part, so lawn clippings, for example. I'm not super phased about that because I have my 3-bay system. I've got plenty of time to fill up a bay, move on, fill up the next bay, and so on before I actually have to come back and start using the compost from the first bay. Having those ideal ratios, it certainly speeds up the composting process. So if you only have one bin, for example, you might want to pay a bit more attention to that. But I know that at the end of the day, the stuff that I put in here will break down, and it will be done by the time I'm ready to come back and use it. But as a general guide, try and make sure that you have more brown stuff than green stuff, and try and keep it moist but not wet, because bacteria and microbes and all those different things that live in the compost and do our work for us effectively, they need moisture to survive, but they need also oxygen. So having them completely submerged in a very wet, sloppy environment isn't great for their health. Now, to the actual compost process. When you think about all the things that go into actually turning the things we put in our compost into the end result, which we then use in our gardens, it's incredibly complex. But the joy is we don't have to do all that work. All we need to do is build a pile of stuff, cover it, keep it kind of moist, and then in 3 to 6 months, depending on how hot it gets, you'll have beautiful broken down compost. That's the genius of letting nature do the hard work for us. Now, in true TV fashion, I have prepared some compost for you earlier. This is a pile of mulch that I had delivered a few months ago. Most of it ended up on the garden, but there was a lot of mulch and only one of me, so there's a little bit left. And what happened as that pile of mulch sat there is that those microbes, those bacteria, or the worms, absolutely went nuts, and they all started to break it down. And what you end up with, instead of mulch, which even here you can see has broken down a little bit, is this beautiful, light, fluffy soil, effectively. It breaks it down, it adds a lot of organic matter. There's hard clay beneath where this is, but this is fluffy, it's light. You can see that I can dig it with my hands, and that is absolutely full of nutrients and things that plants absolutely love.